Right, so if you've been following our progress with the Commodore Plus 4 so far, you'll realise that a simple keyboard swap turned into something a bit more involved. The machine, it failed. It sort of failed after about a few minutes of it being plugged in, switched on, and when it was having a bit of a soak test to find out which keys function correctly, if it was sticking and so on, if there was any oxidization under the keys themselves which was going to cause any problems through use, the machine was starting to drop characters. Now that seemed to be a bit of a precursor to the power supply failing, and what it did, or what it subsequently did, was overvolt, put out far too much voltage. And what it also did was damage the CPU. Now the processors in these are notorious for being damaged, they're notorious for being easily corrupted or breaking down or failing, and it's one of those things with old machines. But to have a fully working machine to suddenly go bad, literally from one moment to the next, just by switching it on, was a little bit of a surprise, because you kind of thought that there would have been some inkling that the failure was going to happen, and there wasn't. There was no noise from the power supply, there was no seeming fluctuations from the way it kind of sat and hummed along as well. There was no fluctuations on the screen, there was none of that. There was no crashing, locking up or anything. So it was an instant over voltage, and that made the processor instantly overheat, start corrupting data, and the machine inevitably failed. Now that made me think about the power supplies once I checked the voltage, and I found that it was putting out 11 volts. 11 volts, over twice what it should have been putting out. So there was no wonder the processor couldn't cope, and it decided enough was enough. So that got me to thinking, if I'm going to repair this machine and I'm going to keep it working, which I want to do anyway, what's the best way of repairing the power supply unit on one of these? Is it taking the 4-pin square adapter off, which was a version of what was used on the Commodore Amiga, and then putting it onto a standard Commodore 64 supply, or even a new Commodore 64 power supply? That would have been the easy option. But the thought of cutting up a good Commodore 64 power supply wasn't really something I wanted to do. So the second option was to have an adapter, which I'll put the pin out, the pin out, or the rough sketch of it on in a moment, to allow me to use the socket, square edge socket, from a standard Commodore 7-pin DIN power supply. So it would mean an adapter between the two, and that would have been great because you could just use a Commodore 64 power supply, but it would have been quite unsightly, because you'd have an adapter sticking out quite a way out the back of the machine even before you ended up putting or plugging in the Commodore power supply. So it wasn't a very elegant or neat solution. The other solution was actually to replace the socket with a standard 7-pin board mounted DIN. So that was a good option, because they're readily available for a few pennies, and you know, desoldering the original and putting in the new one isn't much of a leap. You may have to adapt the pins. You'd need to do a continuity test on to find out which pin or which female pin was going to the legs on the 7-pin DIN, so you get the correct ones going to the motherboard, so you didn't fry anything when you plugged the new power supply into it. Not too hard a job, a little bit more labour intensive than building an adapter really, but at the end of the day it would have been neater. So that's kind of the route I went down, but I managed to get hold of a Commodore 64 7-pinned in, straight out the side of an old Commodore 64 which was totaled, written off. And the reason I went down this route is because when I actually inspected the board, the underside of the Plus 4, I realised that originally these were meant for this 7-pinned in. There's nothing to change. There's nothing to change. There's no pin outs to change. There's no fudging of legs to go into it, etc., or adding extra wiring. There's nothing to change. They will drop right in, and then all you need to do is solder up the two 9 volts, the +5 and the ground, and the machine works. The machine would work a treat, and it wouldn't look out of place. And this is exactly what I've done with this. And if you look at it, you would never ever know that it's had a change unless you seriously knew the Commodore Plus 4 inside out and back to front, because it fits perfectly. So that's the route I went down, and this video is just to show you how the machine came apart. What's not to show you how the machine, or how I soldered every pin onto the machine or desoldered it, because I'm sure most people have seen this time and time again. But I'm just going to show you the before and after, and how it plugged in, and how eventually, it solved that problem. So I hope you enjoy what's coming up, and I hope it gives you a few ideas for your own Plus 4 if you ever need to change the power supply socket because of a dodgy or dead power supply. Okay, so here's the system board, as you may have seen it before in a previous video, and it's fairly straightforward to take out. All you need to do is just to remove a handful of screws just outlined here. And it's not that involved in taking the screws out. Once it's out, you lift it from the left hand side and then just ease the board out, otherwise you could end up breaking the power switch if you just yank it straight up. Okay, once you've done that, that's all there is to it. Okay, so the board can be laid where you need it to be worked on. As you can see, it's the offending article is on the left, and coming up now is the replacement socket. Okay, so it's not dissimilar, it's the same shape, same form factor. And on the underside of the board you can see these are the pins you have to desolder, just being outlined here, and including the two solder pads at the top, which can be quite difficult to remove. Once you've got the socket desoldered, you can just lift it out without dropping it, and then all you need to do then is try and test fit your new one into the same place. As you can see, the pins are identical. So once you test fit it into the motherboard, you can see here it fits perfectly. There's nothing to do on it. And then all you need to do once you're happy with it is start to resolder the new socket onto the board itself. Then the next step from the underside is to solder the 7 solder joints that make up the hard connection for the new socket. And all that's left to do is to put the new repaired board into your existing case. Make sure the switch is to the off position so it doesn't catch, and then just slide the board in once you're happy with the positioning of the switch so it doesn't catch on the plastics. And we just slide it in as so, and then gently lower the left hand corner into its case. And that's all there is to it. And now your board's back in the machine. All that remains is a test of the system now. Power cables, RF cable in, and then you turn it on, and hopefully this is what you see, a nicely repaired Commodore Plus 4. Now, as you can see from the what you've just seen on the video, It powers up, it powers on, everything works the way it should do, and there's no problems with replacing to a 7-pin DIN adapter on the motherboard itself. There's no problems with that. It works really well. The only other issues that this saga isn't quite over with, again because of the overheat and the over voltage issue, it has done a little bit of damage to the processor, and that was to be expected. So my next protocol is going to be working out which is going to be the best way of replacing the CPU on the motherboard itself. Whether I'm going to go down the route of trying to get hold of a working +4 processor, because they were slightly different to the CPU that was used on the 64 and throughout a lot of the 6502 range as well. So what I may do is go down the route of actually putting in a standard 6502 processor, but that's something I'm going to look at next. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you found it informative. And if you do have a +4 and you do have over voltage on the power supply, that's one solution to make sure that you can get the parts for these machines. But I think one of the running themes through a lot of my videos is these machines are going to go wrong, and sometimes originality has to take a back seat for functionality. And the whole point of preserving these machines, I think, is to preserve the functionality of these machines so they do what they were meant to do, even if you have to use components from other systems or workarounds to keep them working. And I think that's one of the good things about owning a classic anything, is that you will find a solution if you look hard enough. So thanks again, and I hope if you like this you'd subscribe. If not, have a great day, and I hope we meet each other on this channel somewhere in the future. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.